and they serve infants, toddlers, and preschoolers. So it didn't include like school age only or Head Start. So the programs that we did survey, though, some had multiple sites like the Y, like Wassa Child Care, and then Newman Catholic Schools has a couple of sites. But it also included centers in Rothschild, Weston, Edgar, Athens, Marathon City. And we received responses from about 75% of those programs. All of the programs were overwhelmingly positive, and each indicated they would participate in this program. Honestly, they're desperate for qualified staff. I wanted to share with you one particular comment, and that was from a director administrator of a 3-star childcare program that's licensed for about 100 children in Wausau. And Lynn, the director, said, "We're struggling to get new staff. We had 3 interviews since Friday and not one showed up. We're struggling to even cover our classrooms right now. We're down 3 teachers and a cook, so staff are working open to close, and that's the fastest way to burn them out. We simply can't afford to lose any more child care programs or child care slots in Marathon County. Just imagine what a scholarship program like this could do for this particular center. An opportunity supported by Marathon County for Marathon County child care programs would allow these centers to offer free training along with incentive pay. And if that were the case, I know I'd showed up for an interview. I intend to be here today during your important discussion about this draft contract. I invite you to use our agency and use myself as a resource today, and I'm here again to answer any questions that you may have. So thank you so much.
That is all the people that have registered for public comment. We have 6 out of the 7 members here. Chair Gibbs is in a meeting in Milwaukee, I think, and may join us later remotely. So with that, we will now move on to the minutes from the August 20th meeting, which are in your packet. What are your wishes? Moved by Supervisor Lemmer to approve. Is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Poole. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of approval of the minutes will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously. All right. We'll jump to item 5A, discussion regarding 2025 annual budget development and policy recommendations for the committee, including review of mandatory discretionary program document and discussion of rates and fees. And I've asked the administrator to give us a summary of what's been happening at some of the other committees as well. So Administrator Leonard.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll give you the Reader's Digest version. We are deep in the wonderful season that is budget season. So kind of walking you through where we are right now. Each of the committees have had the same or similarly worded agenda item on their respective agendas for a number of months now. So I'll start with just some of the conversations and discussions and actions that have taken place at those committees relative to new programs or services or expansions of programs or services. So there's a recommendation to expand what is going to be our beach testing program that is in accordance with a grant currently through the balance of this year, expand that next year to other county owned and operated swimming beaches. That program expansion was recommended by Health and Human Services, and the cost of that was about $12,000. There was a expansion of our lead program related work, again through Health and Human Services, consistent with a grant that was awarded to the city of Wausau, and we would be a contractual subrecipient of that grant, the health department specifically. It's a 3-year grant, as I understand it, with approximately $187,000 per year. But again, it's that work, as I understand it, is entirely grant funded. Our existing work would constitute the required match. We had, that too was through Health and Human Services. There was a recommendation from the Extension Education Economic Development Committee to join through a partnership, the North Central Wisconsin Tourism Partnership. The cost for that is just shy of $4,000 a year. The security guard position at the library, that was reported to the Extension Education Economic Development Committee that the library would be implementing a service contract for that. I met with the library earlier this week relative to the cost. That's approximately $52,000 for that position. And there are some ongoing conversations relative to two topics that at least I see on the radar for potential position expansions or program expansions. Those relate to the Crisis Assessment Response Team. That conversation was had briefly yesterday at Health and Human Services. And then also the idea of creating a county economic development program or position that was started at, that conversation has begun at the Extension Education Economic Development Committee. To this point, I haven't received any direction or action to reduce service level or eliminate programs. There was action taken at each of the committees of jurisdiction relative to the nonprofits. Presentations were made by those nonprofits. All of the committees recommended continuing funding in the 2025 budget consistent with funding provided in this year's budget. So that resolution will be coming to the county board, as I understand it, this month. In terms of new positions and reclasses, there was a recommendation and ultimately approval at HR, Finance, and Property and the required standing committees, I should note, for a position with solid waste and environmental technician to work on the gas wells, restructuring of administrative staff within both conservation planning and zoning and the highway department. And there was a recommendation to approve a reclassification of 2 legal assistants in the district attorney's office to paralegals. In terms of additional work relative to the budget, there has been discussion and action relative to ARPA funding. You're going to be considering today some use of ARPA funding. That's actually a budget amendment of your 2024 budget. But there was a recommendation through Public Safety yesterday to continue the district attorney's office victim witness limited term employee position, which was originally funded as part of the 2023 budget, continued through 2024. That position was funded through American Rescue Plan Act dollars. The recommendation was to continue that form of funding through 2025's budget. With respect to health insurance, we did receive a renewal quote consistent with our budget assumption that was previously approved by this committee and the board. We're still hoping to have some conversations there relative to that renewal. We've held approximately, I'd say certainly more than half of the budget meetings to this point. My direction to staff departments was to really strive for some flat operating budgets. We discussed all of the fees and I should say service fees that departments are charging, again, beginning with the assumption that 3% increase directed by the board would be where we'd start our conversations. I'd say right now the biggest direction I've given to staff, apart from kind of the goals for department heads when they build their budget, has really been around this idea of consolidating our temporary and casual staffing funding. Our process for temporary and casual staffing funding, I think there's an opportunity for us to gain some consistency there, and it should aid us, I should say, in balancing the budget. So simply put, relative to temporary or casual staffing, frequently those are things like summer interns or funding for busy times of the year. I know in one of our departments, we had Veteran Service Office historically had, they have a conference that is scheduled where all the individuals are out of the office, and historically they would contract with a staffing agency to staff that. We eliminated that actually a couple of years ago, and we partnered together with departments to kind of provide that coverage. I'm going to institutionalize that across the organization, so we really try to have a consistent process for temporary and casual staffing. I think those are the highlights right now that I have for for the budget development and the budget discussions that have happened at each of the individual committees and departments. Happy to answer any questions or provide additional updates.
Are there any questions relative to the administrator's report? Are there any other issues that you'd like to see us take up at this committee? Any other? We'll continue to put this on as a placeholder for all of our meetings. And again, the administrator will be rolling out his budget in early October to the various standing committees, and then we'll have a hearing at the end of October, early November, with the public, and then finally approve it in the middle of November. So if not, we will move on to item 5B, developing a framework for the loan for Bug Tussle for purposes of expanding broadband access. And
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be brief, and then I think this is an area for future discussion. But based on the direction at the discussion, I should say, at the previous board meeting and the direction from Broadband Task Force Chairperson Robinson, and who also chairs this committee, that item was pulled, of course, the consideration of the conduit bonding for Bug Tussle with some direction to evaluate alternative strategies, namely a direct loan to Bug Tussle using our general reserve funds. So we've been kind of putting together the overarching framework. Mike and I took a stab at that, and we'll certainly, the next step, I think, in our mind is to really reach out to Bug Tussle and, based on the comments that were had at the county board, make sure it does a couple of things, whatever framework we go to. One is mitigate risk for the county, certainly, while mirroring the access agreement and default protections that were afforded under the initial agreement, but also from the perspective of Bug Tussle, I think recognizing that they need to service that debt. So what does that financial ability to do so look like for them? So right now, what our thought process is to combine those, a draft for review, combine the two projects into one project for purposes of the loan. So that would be an $8 million loan with a repayment where the first 5 years, based on the statements made by Bug Tussle, but also some of the conversation at the various, the task force and the full board, it would be structured as interest only for those first 5 years to allow Bug Tussle to put in that infrastructure, develop the customer base to service that loan. The remaining 5 years, 5 through 6 of that would be a repayment schedule that would be not interest only, that it would serve interest and principal. However, the discussion with Bug Tussle will need to be about how long that amortization schedule is for the overall amortization of the loan. The idea, however, based on the discussion at the full board, is have the balance of the loan, whatever the payments are going to be, years 6 through 10, if those are based on, for example, a 30-year amortization schedule, still year 10 would be when their balloon payment would be due. Bug Tussle could then, whether they refinance that or pay it in full, that's kind of where what we're putting together right now in terms of a structure. But the next step, I think, from staff, ultimately it's a policy question for the board, what you're trying to accomplish in terms of that loan payment, but give that to Bug Tussle and let them ascertain whether or not the financials work for them. But based on the conversations and the direction from Chair Robinson, putting together an alternative funding strategy that doesn't tie up whether it's a conduit bond with a 30-year amortization or a loan from the general fund, that it's got a shorter period of kind of impact on the county's financials, whether it's direct financial impact, which you'd see with a direct loan from your reserves, or a conduit bond note within our financials that, based on the guarantee, there would have been a requirement to note that in the financials. Hope that makes sense. I don't know, Mike, if there's anything you wanted to add to that, kind of how we've been trying to structure it. Quite honestly, that's what Kewaunee County did. So Mike reached out to Kewaunee County, got their documents. We've been kind of using those documents and then also supplementing with the documents that the county board approved in connection with the original conduit bond, to kind of make sure we do those two things: mitigate risk and also secure the same access rights that we would have with respect to the original infrastructure, which is the dark fiber and the ability to put equipment on towers.
I don't have a lot to add. Lance covered kind of our work to date very well. The idea behind the existing draft, as Lance indicated, is to get all of the strong protections, the strongest protections that we can build in for the county, as well as ensuring the county's ability to access the assets, utilize them for tower use if we need to, utilize the fiber, but also limiting the risk further by reducing that length of repayment. And it is based on, right now, it's based on a Kewaunee County loan document, but there's been substantial revisions to that based on adding as many protections for the county as we can. And I agree with Lance. I think our next step would be to start that back and forth discussion with Bug Tussle and try to get an understanding on a draft agreement that we could then bring back for your review.
I think the intent is we just wanted to bring it to you so for transparency. There obviously still is an opportunity to do conduit bonding in the future if the county decides not to use reserve fund, based on a conversation that I had with Scott Fell this morning. But I think the advantage of this is that we don't have the capitalized interest where we have additional risks. So I think what we need to do is just move forward with discussions with the draft, bring it back, and then get input on that draft. But you've heard the parameters. Does anybody have concerns about the overall parameters of what we're looking at? Supervisor Lemmer.
I don't know if it's a concern. I'm not really sure what the ramifications are of using a reserve. So can you talk a little bit about, what that means and how to rebuild it? What the reserve is really for traditionally?
Well, Sam can take a lot of that, but this is the one thing that I really was concerned about. We actually reached out to our financial advisor, PFM, prior to the conduit issue being discussed at the county board. The important thing for us, and I know we're not doing it, the county's not doing it, it hasn't done it last year, not envision doing it this year through the budget, but our bond rating. It's really important that we try to maximize that bond rating so we get advantageous rates. One of the things we asked PFM to do was to look at whether or not the county serving as the conduit issuer, as was originally envisioned, would impact that bond rating. The answer to that was no, based on their review. But the second thing we asked was, well, what if we do a loan through our reserve fund? Would that likewise pose any risk to our bond rating? And based on their assessment right now, that answer was likewise no. So otherwise, generally speaking, how I look at the reserve is, as you saw in the audit, it's best practice to have a reserve for purposes of just what you would have a reserve for personally when things don't go great, and also to serve as working capital. So I don't know, but that's my simple county administrator review of it. Sam, I don't know if there's anything you want to expound upon.
No, I think you did a good job on that. Your reserve, you just kind of want to have in place in case things come up out of your control. And then there are things, like you said, the working capital is in place for cash flow purposes. That is in there.
And it does impact, one of the things that the bond ratings agencies, Moody's, would look at is what is your existing reserve and what is your reserve policy, and are you following it? And based on all those things, PFM said, hey, if you do this reserve, this loan from the reserve, they don't anticipate it having any impact on our bond rating. Is that fair, Mike? That was my recollection. Okay.
Supervisor Lemmer.
So just, those were my questions. What is our reserve balance? And then how does it get paid back and at what schedule?
So your reserve, I don't know if it's, Sam, you can articulate this better than me. I mean, the idea that you need to pay it back necessarily isn't necessarily a requirement. The question is, do you have enough within the reserve to fund the necessary things from a cash flow perspective, but also to meet your best practices through whatever we set for our reserve policy, maintain our rating agency rating. So the reserve, generally speaking, when we get to the end of the year and we have balances within the individual department budgets, our process, as you guys have talked about a number of times, is that in the year following the audit, when we audit those rollover balances, that amount above our reserve and working capital policy is what funds our annual capital improvement project fund. So that's the kind of the interplay of how those things come together. I don't know, Sam. I mean, we've spent out of the general fund before without expressly saying, hey, we're going to pay it back or make it whole. The last time that I recall the county doing it, I want to say it was 2018 or 19 with the remodeling, the reinforcement work that was done in the Marathon County Jail. It was a significant expenditure out of the reserve. But there are different strategies with reserves. Marathon County has not historically deficit spent out of reserve as part of their annual budget process. There are other counties that do that, have a reserve target, and through the annual budget process, deficit spend to hit that target.
We've also done that relative to the highway reserves, relative to some of our immediate culvert replacements and other things. So we have a practice of dipping into the reserves when we have an unexpected issue. But I think the intent would be that we repay and replenish, but that's more of a policy decision for the board on how we would handle that.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing we would like to get some direction on relative to the parameters for this agreement. Even an interest-only loan from the general fund will result in significant annual interest-only payments to the county. Where is it you would like those to go? I think to Chair Robinson's point, it makes logical sense if you want to put them in the general fund to quote-unquote replenish that, or do you want to segregate those into a fund that is aimed at accomplishing what the goal the county has prioritized, the county board has prioritized, which is broadband expansion? Do you want those funds to essentially go back to be available for further expansion projects? Those are really questions for the board. I don't know, Sam, am I missing anything on that?
And we can decide that the conditions relative to the agreement with Bug Tussle are sort of separate from how we apply those proceeds coming back in. So the latter issue would be one that would be exclusively within the purview of the county board, whether we would replenish a reserve, set it aside. In others, I don't know that Bug Tussle would particularly have an interest or a stake in that, but we would need to probably address that within the same resolution or shortly thereafter.
And I think there is that's another mechanism you can use to mitigate risk, is as you take in those revenues, because again, I think the board did a nice job of kind of articulating and discussing those potential risks of default. If you take those revenues and don't spend them necessarily right away, but rather put them in a fund, whether it's for further broadband expansion or for essentially a specific reserve in the event of default, ultimate default, you mitigate the risk relative to your ability to service that. Well, you're essentially not having to service debt. You issued the debt. It's just, do you want to have that set aside to mitigate that hit?
Any other concerns? Again, anything will come back to this group as a draft, and but we need a point on which to begin. All right. Now we'll move on to item C. The easement, I assume, Mike, that's yours?
As always, easements are mine. So this probably looks a little bit familiar. It's another easement request for the solid waste facility site. This one is resulting from a need to move some of the existing electrical underground infrastructure based on construction and changes on the solid waste site. So it actually completely benefits our solid waste department to move the easement to allow the electric stuff to be moved to a place that's actually accessible. So I've talked through this with our solid waste director, Dave Hagenbuscher, who gave me the background on that. The easement as currently written is a permanent easement. The current easement that's in place in a different area that's being moved to this area is also a permanent easement. If your direction is to try to secure a temporary easement, I can certainly have that conversation with Wisconsin Public Service. I can say that all of their other easements on solid waste property are permanent easements, but they were open to that discussion last time, so I could have that discussion again.
Are there any questions? I think I was the one that raised the issue of whether we could have that be a time certain or temporary reviewable easement with then not relinquishing our interest in those should uses change and there no longer be a need for that. So it would probably provide the county with additional flexibility in the future should that use or that easement no longer be needed. But any questions from the committee? Well, the issue is before us for approval. And what feedback did you get from WPS? Did you execute the temporary?
So the previous easement that we had on the solid waste facility, I went back and asked if they would consider temporary easement, and they accepted all of our proposed changes, and that was executed per the direction from this committee. So if you made the same ask and direction today, I would pursue the same path.
So what are your wishes? Again, this is an easement necessitated by changes due to the operations at the landfill. So accommodating our needs with an easement. Supervisor Hart.
Thank you. So just to clarify, this easement isn't really much different than any of the other easements we have with the solid waste department and Wisconsin Public Service, correct?
Exactly correct. It's actually identical to other easements we have. It's just in a slightly different area because of changes on the facility.
And with that, then I would make a motion to approve the easement as is here.
As
As is here.
I'm sorry, I still didn't.
As is here.
Okay, here versus permanent versus temporary.
Whichever one this is, which I'm assuming is the permanent one, right? Yeah.
Is there a second? Under discussion. Again, I would recommend that we look at a temporary easement consistent with their use, so as not to obligate the property into perpetuity. Should uses change, I think it is easier for us to terminate the easement at that time with a temporary easement versus a permanent easement. And it appears as if WPS is open to the concept of temporary easements. Supervisor Marshall.
To make it a temporary easement, do we need to amend the motion?
Yes.
I would like to amend the motion to become a temporary easement and have Corp Council go down that path if the motion person is amiable to that.
Is there a second? Second by Supervisor Lemmer. Any discussion on the amendment? If not, all those in favor of adoption of the amendment, change it to a temporary easement, will signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously. Now the motion as amended to approve the easement. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed?
Aye.
No? Okay. Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously. Thank you. All right, we will now go on to item 6A1, approve carry forward for UW Extension Programming. Sam, is that you?
Yes, UW couldn't be here this afternoon due to other obligations. The request before you is just programmatic carryovers from 2023 into the 2024 budget. It's generally done on an annual basis and is generated from program revenues.
Okay. And we've traditionally done this,
Correct.
so are there any questions for Sam? If not, what are your wishes? What are your wishes? Supervisor Marshall.
Move to approve.
Supervisor Marshall moves to approve the carry forward for the UW Extension Programming. Is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Lemmer. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of approving the carry forward will signify by saying aye. Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. All right, we're on to A2. Consideration and recommendation of the Extension Education Economic Development Committee to amend the 2024 budget to transfer $20,000 of American Rescue Plan Act funds to address child care shortage through a service contract. Supervisor Marash, would you like to address this?
Thank you. So one of the priorities that the EED committee identified at the beginning of this term was to tackle the child care issue we have in Marathon County. And it's not only in Marathon County, it's all over the nation, obviously. But we've been meeting, the work group that Kelly mentioned, we've been meeting regularly for many months now, trying to find out different strategies, what we could do to help the different providers in our area. And this is what we kind of came up with, because opening more child care centers isn't going to help because we don't have the people to work there. And if we open another child care center, they're going to steal the employees from the ones that are already open. So the bottom line is we need more people to work in child care. So this also brings in different community partners like the ECDC. We met with Janice Watson. She identified that she has several members in their community that are interested in working in childcare, which would be really beneficial for them because they would be able to help support their families in this community and become more of an integrated part of our community, which I think is really important. Also, another partner would be the City of Wausau with the possibility of community development block grant funds. I realize that this is listed as 2 years. We have to even find out if it will work at all before we can think beyond that. But we've already met with the Community Foundation to see how we can go forward with that. And our work group isn't done. We will continue to be working on all these things and answering questions and finding out how well this is working, if it's working at all, and be able to make adjustments as we go. So with the 30 people over 2 years that we would be able to train, hopefully, if we can find people that are interested to participate. We don't even know if we can do that, but at least this would give an opportunity for people to have their training paid for and then have the stipends for their wage increases, because it's really difficult to make ends meet for everybody, but especially for people that are working in childcare right now. And it's a very stressful job. Even when I have a friend that works in childcare, and the story she says, I'd be waving the white flag at this point. So I have a lot of respect for them. As far as just strategic goals for the county, this would help with a lot of our strategic plan goals. Objective 3.3, for instance, ensure that every person makes it to adulthood with health, stability, and growth opportunity. Objective 10.6, ensure the future availability of skilled and flexible workforce prepared to meet the needs of both existing and emerging industries and technologies. Objective 10.8, encourage development and redevelopment of key employment centers in areas that possess strong market potential, provide good transportation access for workers, and promote the efficient movement of goods. And 10.10, create an innovative atmosphere to foster an entrepreneurial, supportive environment. So there is absolutely the possibility that if we do have people that get trained and they work in an existing child care, maybe they will want to go out on their own and start their own business. That would be fantastic. But we have to start somewhere. So I urge you to support this. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you. In reviewing this, I think this is a really great plan. I had one quick question on the reimbursement requirement. It says participants who leave the childcare profession, so that links them to just the childcare profession. They could move from one employer to another as long as it was within the childcare profession, correct?
Right,
Okay,
yes.
perfect, because I think that would be a really good thing to keep people in the profession. I know in my job I have to complete certification that takes 3 years, so that's definitely going to make me stick around in my profession. Not that I'm looking to leave, but I definitely won't be doing the millennial thing of staying at a job for a couple of years and then finding a different job. So I think that kind of incentivizes and puts people with a little skin in the game to get this qualification and stay in an industry that we need people to stay in. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The overwhelming benefit is not only to the community, but especially to the employers, which I brought up at the initial meeting and said, that the chamber came and said we all have to have a part. And so I had suggested that this program should be a match. The chamber comes up with a certain amount of money and we match that program, especially since they are the greatest beneficiary of this. And the other piece that I would like to see changed is not be a grant program, but if we're purchasing services, we should be structuring it as when someone signs up for the training, they get done with the training, then we pay a certain amount. When they're placed, we pay another certain amount so that we are guaranteed to get what we pay for rather than paying everything up front and then hoping we get the results.
Well, I can take a stab at, I think the long-term goal is to truly make this a public-private partnership. And what we're trying to do is use the American Rescue Plan Act dollars to address it. And, one time I think I saw a statistic, and I think 35+% of the women that left the workforce during the pandemic did not return. And one of the reasons was childcare. Either it was unaffordable, unavailable. And I think that is one of the purposes behind the American Rescue Plan Act and trying to get that, you know, the people impacted through the pandemic back to work. And I think we're still seeing some of the consequences of that in addition to the worker shortage. And while I'm not adverse to looking long-term at that public-private partnership based upon the discussions that have been had with the Community Foundation and the Chamber, and McDevco has been involved in this. But I think it's critical that we start the program to see if it will be successful. And one of the problems relative to training is typically it's a pay for it up front, not pay for it on completion. You know, in terms of providing the training, you don't pay for your college education or other courses after the fact. You pay for them up front, and we need to attract as many people as we can into this area to try to deal with this critical shortage. And it's a shortage that Marathon County is not unique in experiencing, but rather, you know, we join a lot of others, and it's an innovative approach based upon long discussions with the business community. And I share your concern on wanting that partnership, but I don't know that we have time to put that in place up front. Supervisor Morash.
Thank you, Chair. And I just want to make sure Kelly backs me up on this, because at our last meeting, it's my understanding that the people that will be in the scholarship program will be working and getting their training at the same time. So it will fill needs right out of the gate. Correct?
Administrator Leonard.
I'll let Kelly, if you have anything to add to that point first.
Thank you. I appreciate that comment, Supervisor Marshall. And I think what we talked about here is sort of a tiered approach, right? Like the suggested use of the stipend would be at a 6-month interval. They'd receive a certain, perhaps $500. Staying another 6 months would earn them $750. So it's a tiered approach to compensating them, you know, after they've committed to being at a center for a certain length of time. So I appreciate that.
Perfect. And that was going to be, to your point, Supervisor Marshall, very well stated. I took a crack at drafting this agreement, the draft that's in there, and we certainly still need some work, but I sent an email to Chair Morash with those 2 points that you raised, one about that Chair Robinson referenced. I just couldn't think of a mechanism whereby we would allocate the funds contingent upon buy-in from businesses now, but I certainly think your point is very well taken there. And then second, with respect to how the contract is drafted, I went back and forth. I wrote an email. I went back and forth on whether to draft this as requiring a periodic invoicing of child caring to the county to disperse the funds, but ultimately I think I went back to, hey, this is a lump sum payment to child caring, but through our agreement, we can structure a requirement that they only expend the funds in a periodic approach. I mean, selfishly, the only other time I've had to approve a whole bunch of invoices outside of my regular job is with the broadband project, and I was reviewing a whole bunch of invoices for fiber and conduit and handholds and all, and it just is a lot of work. So I think we can make child caring do exactly what you were alluding to, but the idea after, and this is just my thought, so if the direction is to do it differently, I literally drafted the language the other way, so I can go back to it. To require invoicing periodically by child care to get the funds, as opposed to the idea that they provide us quarterly reports detailing their expenditures, which is what I put in section 2.2. Happy to do that. Went back and forth. I don't know that there's one that's perfect and one that's not. It was just an approach. But I think each of your points are very well taken.
Supervisor Lemmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just to put a punctuation mark on something Chair Morash said, we continue to meet as a group, and I got the sense, I'm hoping everybody else in the meeting got the sense that Dave Ekman and the business community are also thinking about how to make this sustainable. And there could be, nothing's laid out officially yet, but there could be input from their end as well. At least I'm angling on that end. So it's continued discussion.
Supervisor Marshall.
This seems to be the reason that we're not requiring the business community to take part is because of the ARPA funds need to be distributed by the end of the year. However, we do have a huge capital budget that the ARPA funds can be deployed for. And could not this program be funded through the $800,000 contingency that was in the administrator's budget last year? And then we don't have such a tight time frame that we can't get that commitment from the chamber.
I'll try to respond to that, and please correct me, but I think the desire is to try to get this off the ground and get it started as soon as we can to address a critical need. And I think the thought was that if we could advance it through the use of the ARPA dollars, and again, it's consistent use with the ARPA dollars, and if you take it out of the contingency fund, that reduces the fund balance for capital projects in the future. So there are, it's a shell game, but it's, again, I think the desire was to try to get action taken as soon as we could to try to address a critical need and not be contingent upon other parties to come to the table, but rather work with those parties to get them to the table in the future. Supervisor Hart.
Thank you. And I want to emphasize how important this need is. My sister-in-law was someone who had to drop out of the workforce because childcare was cost prohibitive. She actually was making less money sending my niece and nephew to daycare. And this has been a 4-year struggle now. My nephew has semi-permanent childcare now because he started preschool. So, I mean, and this whole summer, both my brother and my sister-in-law have been taking the kids to work, and my brother works construction and my sister cleans houses. So my sister-in-law cleans houses. So this is a critical need. This is happening here in Marathon County. So I want to emphasize that this is very much needed. And I think the chamber and this work group has done a really good job at identifying the reason. And it really is a workforce shortage that's causing a workforce shortage. We've got to stop it somewhere. And I think this at least helps it somewhere. Thank you.
Any other questions? If not, what are the wishes of the committee? What are the wishes of the committee? Supervisor Lemmer.
So I would move to recommend or to accept the recommendation from the EED committee to amend the 2024 budget to transfer $200,000 of America Rescue Plan Act funds to address the child care shortage through a service contract.
And forward it to the county board?
Yes, please.
All right, is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Hart. Is there any discussion? Supervisor Poole.
I would just like to say that since this is ARPA money, a one-time payment kind of uses a Band-Aid to help us get through until things can become a better solution to it in bigger terms. I would support it going to the full board for a vote, but the caveat being, I think it's beyond the scope of county government to be funding child care. So anything future, certainly we'd have to see what it is. But I think state, federal government, if they want to get involved, that's fine. But county government, I don't see it as a proper role.
Supervisor Hart.
And I will echo that too. I think that's why we're going to need chamber buy-in in the future. I think that this is something that we can get off the ground now, make it successful, and then we're going to need that buy-in from businesses. We're going to need to make this a private-public partnership, whether it's private-public through the county, state, or federal. We've got to do something about it, which is why I think it's a good use of the funds.
Supervisor Lemmer.
Yeah, I would just say that I think child care is infrastructure, and so I think it is appropriate to get some sort of public funding, I agree. I think it should be at the state and federal level, but because they're not doing anything, I don't think we can sit back with our hands on our laps and just wait for them to act. And so I really appreciate the leadership of that child caring and Supervisor Marash or Chair Marash for bringing this forward, because I think we do need to do something.
Any other discussion? If not, all those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no? No. That motion carries, but it is not unanimous. Next, we will move on to presentation of the Highway Department Wausau Shop relocation planning efforts and next steps. Mr. Griesbach. And Chair Gibbs has joined us.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm here today to talk about a long ongoing issue we've been having at the department. We've been looking for a long time regarding a new place to put our highway shop. On July 11th, the infrastructure approved the plan, and the plan was to advance the decision, what I'll share with you a little bit later, to this committee for further development.
If I can just add a little context, so you're going to have, if you see from your agenda, if it's a bit confusing, the idea is a fair amount of this is going to be open session, but there are some parts that we are asking you to consider a closed session discussion relative to the presentation. But Jim is going to give you the Reader's Digest version of that long-standing consideration that the county board has had relative to the Wausau shop.
Now I got to eliminate some of my pages. So these studies began way back in 2016. We've had 7 studies completed between 16 and last year. We've kind of gone full circle, which you'll see later on in the presentation also. Over this period of time, we've evaluated over 20 different sites for possible locations. We've considered multiple configurations, and we'll just kind of go through those real quick here. Our existing site sits on 9 acres right on the corner of 17th and West. We've been there since about the mid-1930s. The site has served us well, but we just outgrown the yard and buildings. We have more equipment. We have larger equipment. I'll give you a couple quick examples here is when we go out plowing at night and we come in at 11 o'clock at night, we need to unhook the plows, put them out, park our equipment in the shed so we can melt and stay warm. The next morning we go back at it at 3:30 in the morning. The drivers need to go back out, hook up the plows again before we go. This is a daily routine. Our doors, our buildings aren't big enough to hose those vehicles at this point. There's a lot of issues at our existing site. I mean, some of them are small in stature when you start looking at the overall project, but we have multiple doors, overhead doors. Those huge doors, they need to be replaced. They're $22,000 a piece. We have a bridge crew shed that's in dire need of new sheeting and insulation. Again, we're sitting on 9 acres. We have no room for any storage. If a flood comes through or something, we have no area to store materials, no area to store pipes, so we're running constantly to go get those. And one of the main other factors is this site was part of the West Side Master Plan that was approved by County Board a number of years ago. We do have an array of buildings out there. It's kind of a mishmash of different buildings. Kind of interesting. It's out there. If you see building number 9, kind of off on the right, that used to be the old bookmobile building. We use it now for our bridge crew building. Building number 5, the one on the left, that was one of the existing first buildings there. That was the building from the 1930s. I've been around for a while, but not since that building's been built. I've been told the reason that the concrete's higher is that's where they fed the horses when we had the horses back in the 30s. Building number 12, that was moved from our Elderon site. So we have a big variety of buildings through this area serving a lot of different needs. Again, going way back to 2016, when Brad Carger was administrator, I explained to him, we need a new highway shop, and if we don't buy land now, we're going to be buying land at the edge of town. And the time we build a building, that edge of town is going to be either Marathon or Mosinee. And we're starting to approach that because we never did do anything back when we originally started. So we did do our first study back in 2016, and that was a space needs study. And that was saying, let's just take the highway department just by ourselves and see what we need. So we worked with Barrientos design and consulting firm, and we've been working with them on most of these studies. We went through each department, see what we needed for our needs. It came up we needed about 240,000 square feet, and the cost of the facility back in 2016 was $27,513,222. You just might want to mark that number down because as we go through this, you're going to see some needs. At that point, with that price, everybody was kind of a little shocked, and the project was shelved. So in 2018, we did our second study. That study looked at a combination building with building maintenance, the Parks Department maintenance, that'd be the Parks Department and Sheriff's maintenance. Sheriff's maintenance is being for serving their vehicles. We looked at that building. The total facility was 342,000 square feet, and the cost of that facility back in 2016 with that additional square footage jumped up to over $53 million. So at that point, we decided, well, we need a site if we are going to build a building. So we did another study in 2018 to look at that multi-building, multi-department facility. Some of the things that we really wanted, we wanted something near the 51 I-39 interchange, 29 interchange. We need sewer and water. So at that point, we reviewed 14 different sites throughout the Wausau area. And after the completion of the study, we had found a couple sites up in the village of Maine by the Witter Farms that kind of rose to the top of the claim. Even though with the best effort, nothing really happened back at that time, so the project again was shelved. So we jumped up to 2020.
Well, maybe one thing to add, unless you're going to talk about it later.
That still comes to happen in
Okay.
20.
Okay.
In 2020, we decided, well, let's make that site a little bit bigger even. Let's add emergency management and CPC to the site, which added another 30,000 square feet to the project. So we again went back to the drawing board and we looked at different sites. We added a couple more sites. We added a site out in Satine, and we added our existing site on West Street to look at it. Looking at the other sites, Satine and the Witter Farm one, Witter Farms again remained our top site. We had numerous meetings with the village of Maine at the time, and after numerous meetings, The site was removed due to the village rejected any idea about changing their zoning. They said they would consider changing their zoning if we would do a pilot, payment in lieu of taxes. And as a county, we decided that's nothing that we want to venture into to open up that can. So the Village of Maine site went away at that point. And we looked at the town of Satine at that point, which was kind of on the small side. It was under 30 acres and had a price tag of $76,911,500. At that point, again, the project sat there for a couple more years until 2022 popped along. In 2022, we reevaluated the sites again. We found a site in Weston, one in Rib Mountain, and again, we looked at the the Satine site, but we added a neighbor's parcel on there, so our access would actually have come off with 72nd Avenue. So we reviewed those few sites. Time we got to the development of those sites, the one in Rib Mountain was sold for a residential area, and the one in Satine was sold for commercial. The one in Satine, I think, was a real possibility. The one in Rib Mountain, my personal opinion was Rib Mountain wasn't going to change their zoning for us anyhow at that time. So both of those sites were off the board. So we rolled along up to 2023. And again, we reviewed the Weston site. And we spoke to Weston, and Weston also determined that they would not rezone for us. So I started seeing a pattern after speaking to a lot of municipalities that nobody really wanted the highway department for a neighbor. Hurt my feelings a little bit, but I got over that. And then we just started looking. We started saying, do we need that big of a site? You know, we were over 40 acres that we wanted for the entire site for all of them. So we went back to where we were 7 years earlier and said, what would the cost and what would it look like just for a highway department now here in 2023? And the site also had gone up to $85 million for the combination site between all those departments.
So if I can add a little bit of flavor to that, and I know I always take the optimistic side. The best things come to those who wait. See how I did that, Jim? So a little bit of additional information relative to the process. So when Jim talks about like, hey, this has been a long-standing process, the county was very close to buying land in 2019. In December of 2019, it was on the board floor to purchase that property in the Witter Farm up in what is now the Village of Maine. And it was only after some additional discussion that there was a staff recommendation to pull that because of that zoning concern. But the idea that the highway department, the Wausau shop, needs to move is not at all new. As Jim said, it's really been a long-standing push to identify that future home. Now, when I say the best things come to those who wait, Jim's recitation also is consistent with the story that, I mean, this committee has heard a great number of times about the county pursuing a consolidation of our footprint. The way we were going to do that in 2019 and before was, hey, let's consolidate the highway department. We need to move them. We need to get a site. They do stuff with Parks, Rec, and Forestry. We have vehicles that need maintenance with the sheriff's office. You know, the idea that we can consolidate emergency management, because at the time, emergency management was also different. They had a lot of vehicles that they needed storage for. So it's that overall story of consolidation. It was going to be accomplished through this multi-facility. This was going to be campus number 2 in addition to the courthouse, largely. But as you all know, We accomplished that ultimately after some of the challenges here. We identified an alternative strategy when the county started considering improvements to our Lakeview campus. We no longer have the need. It's not like, hey, the cost has been driving this. Certainly cost is one of the key drivers, but also the need to consolidate on a single site, emergency management, parks, rec and forestry, conservation, planning and zoning, and the sheriff's office fleet no longer exists. The vast majority of those departments are going to be down at our Lakeview campus. So you're accomplishing all the goals that you had through facility consolidation without some of the costs. I mean, certainly you're having costs at Lakeview, but like Jim talked about, the cost escalation really has increased substantially since this conversation started. And I still remember that December meeting in 2019. I was not the administrator at the time. And again, we were very close. The county was very close to purchasing land and then pursuing a zoning change that thankfully the county board was very prudent and said, you know what, we're going to not accept this offer. We're not going to put in this offer to purchase. We're not going to proceed. We're going to make sure we get our zoning pieces in line. And to Jim's point that he said before, make sure that our neighbors, whoever they ultimately are going to be, are good neighbors for us and we're good neighbors for them. So that has also driven a portion of the kind of activity over the last several years and all the conversations at infrastructure. Sorry to steal any thunder you had there.
So we did review our site again. Again, if we add on a little bit with some land that we could develop to the east of us, we got up to 12 acres of site if we would develop at our existing site. Some of the drawbacks of our existing site is the traffic is a nightmare right now trying to get to our facility. We love Quick Trip across the road from us for lunch, but the rest of the day it kind of hurts us. We have a very hard time getting in and out of 17th Street is becoming the new Grand Avenue, people heading down to Rim Mountain. It's a very busy street. The contingencies in the estimate that we have gotten from Barrientos we're at 5%. Talking to Troy at Facilities and Chris a little bit, they both feel that that's a pretty light number when you start digging into a site that we possibly know that we may have some ground issues, and that building's built in the 30s, so we figured it's more of a 10% contingency, which would add another 3.4 million onto it. Another drawback is we have a satellite shop in Mosinee right now. That is at the end of the runways in Mosinee. The FAA has politely told us that we need to move shortly. Been working with Brian. We don't have a date on that, but if we need to move that existing facility down there to another site in that area, we're probably looking at a $5 to $6 million new satellite shop in Mosinee. So we would still need to do that if we stayed at West Street. There's no room for operations during construction if we stay here. They're having a very hard time with layout on this building right now. The layout on this, the driveways would come out right south of the railroad tracks, which I told them that's not possible. And again, as I mentioned earlier, if we stay here, it does not align with the master plan for moving the West Side master plan, which was adopted by the full county board. And I'm going to let Lance run off with finance.
All right. I'll grab this. Well, and sorry for the pressure, Sam, but you're going to have to help me with no notice if there's anything that I say that is not accurate. I'm sure a lot of it will be not precise, but make sure it's accurate. So we got this information from our financial advisors, and it's really just to give you a little bit of the lay of the land and kind of how you might choose to finance this project when the county board does move forward with it, if it does. So this county outstanding general obligation debt slide should look somewhat familiar, particularly the left side of it. That has the total debt service that the county has outstanding, excluding Central Wisconsin Airport. The right side of the graph is really, quite honestly, my best attempt. I asked PFM, a financial advisor, to look in the crystal ball and see what we've been doing historically and what that might look like in terms of net debt service and mill rate. So kind of current state, at least the last couple of years, from this year's budget for sure, we utilized sales tax revenue to offset some of our debt, which is, again, prudent practice. You want to mitigate the need to put something on levy. It's take some of your sales tax you're collecting now so you're not levying additional tax. Mitigates the need to borrow as well when you use it for capital projects. The middle column, the North Central repayment revenues, is the 2.5 million is the amount that North Central is due to service in 2025. Excuse me. The existing schedule for North Central does ramp up to about $4.1 million over the next several years. It's essentially $500,000 a year it goes up. I asked PFM to, at least for purposes of these charts, put $2.5 million in there because a lot of things have changed since the county board adopted the plan down at Lakeview relative to North Central Healthcare and how they were intending to finance that debt back when the nursing home was built. I just met with Sam and Chris just met with Gary Olson this morning from North Central. That landscape is different. So take a very conservative, a more conservative, I shouldn't say very conservative, but a more conservative repayment obligation annually, keep the sales tax in there. And what does that mean in terms of net debt service and mill rate? That's what PFM put together for us. They put it in some nice graphs, which we appreciate because I think it shows the strategy kind of comes out as to when you might choose to fund a new significant expenditure through bonding. It's generally when you have a drop off in these debt service levy charts. That's standard. I talked to my colleagues from other counties, and Sam, Chris, please feel free to chime in. You time your big projects so that when you hear it a lot with school districts, with referendums, you time it so that you try to keep that debt levy relatively consistent. You don't want to have peaks and valleys because that people do better with more stable property tax bills. So this is kind of current state. When you look at that last table with existing net debt service, it's just exhibited in a chart. Here is that same information relative to mill rate. So like I said before, you look for those opportunities when you have drops. The mill rate, you might say, well, why do these charts look different? This one's flat, the existing net debt service, and the mill rate, why is that one going down? The reason it goes down, your mill rate, is the same way that our mill rate goes down through our general property tax levy. You have equalized value go up, drives the mill rate down. It's that function of levy limits. So assuming that equalized value continues to grow at a fairly conservative rate, this is what PFM put together for how our mill rate is going to look moving forward. So financing the highway shop. There was a question before, very apropos question. What is the purpose of reserves? And Jim has a highway reserve, and that highway reserve has a substantial balance in it, which is good when you're planning for large projects. So not to belabor the point, but if we ballpark a project for a new highway shop, PFM put this together as well. If you think about a project in that $59 million or $60 million ballpark area, we have new highway shop, the idea being issuing $30 million in general obligation notes, and the remaining $29 million being funded through the project. This is kind of what that breakdown would look like. The total amount of bonds, again, would be that 30 million. This chart is the historical valuation. It really speaks to that comment I made before about the mill rate going down, the change in equalized value over time. You can see that if you look at the last 5-year average, last 10-year average, or last 18 years, certainly we've had more aggressive growth relative to equalized value in the last couple of years than we've had over the last nearly 20 or 18 is what PFM put together. So this is what it would look like when PFM said, okay, if you were going to move forward with a highway shop with that funding strategy of splitting it essentially between the highway reserve as a funding source and the issuance of general obligation notes, or bonds, I should say, general obligation bonds. They put in place, here are the assumptions at the top. Again, you issue that debt in 2027. You would, the debt structure was really essentially a standard debt structure, and we could change things on the margins, but for purposes of this conversation, they wanted to just put together this chart with a projected interest rate of 5% and a growth in value, and that's equalized value of 4%, which again, if you go back here, I think is pretty conservative. Our equalized value growth the last 2 years was in that 12% range, and it's escaping me what it is today for this year. I want to say it was 9. So pretty substantial the last couple of years. But this is, again, the debt schedule and what that would look like, servicing those bonds over time. And this is the chart that they put together, which again speaks more to me as opposed to a finance person. And Sam, feel free to jump in at any point. But you see kind of how PFM put together, and this is what it communicates to me. There's an opportunity to keep that relatively flat. Now, we would have to develop a strategy for those internal years of 28 through 31, but it really goes back and correlates to when you have those larger amounts of debt falling off of our repayment obligation. So that is the kind of what that would look like with the existing net debt service plus that $30 million issuance. And this is what that looks like in terms of mill rate. So again, you have the same sort of uptick, but I think there's an opportunity, and I haven't asked this of PFM, but we could sit down and talk about what does that strategy look like to try to flatten that, because I assume that would be the desire of the county board if we were going to move forward. You don't want to have a substantial increase. But using that existing net debt service levy plus the $30 million issuance and assuming that slow, consistent growth of equalized value, you nevertheless see that mill rate continues to drop. So this is where I'm really going to struggle with graph explanations, but PFM in their presentation previously included a market index relative to municipal bonds over the last 20 years. And this is not surprising, I think, to anyone, but that bond market is somewhat volatile. You'll see that when we timed our project at the Lakeview campus, we were borrowing at about the best time to borrow money. Couldn't have timed that any better, other than maybe if we would have got all the borrowing done before it started to go up a little bit again. But overall, very, very favorable conditions relative to borrowing. You do see they have ticked up a little bit, but those things relative to the action by the Fed have also started to moderate a little bit in the very recent past. So that's a quick overview of the financial materials that PFM put together relative to kind of the discussion about a new highway shop. Want to make sure we covered everything before, and we'll take any questions you guys might have now before we ultimately consider a motion to go into closed session. And it is on the slide, but I would just ask when you're ready to, all your open session questions have been answered. The closed session language on the agenda is more expansive, so I think Corp Counsel would likely prefer you make that motion if you're considering making one.
Before we entertain any motion, are there any questions of Kurt? Chair Gibbs?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the question I have is, Administrator Leonard, did PFM give you an indication as to the interest rate on bonding right now? Because I just sat through a meeting where there's an anticipation that the Fed may drop the interest rate on the Feds by 3 times yet this year, and potentially some additional next year by as much as 25 basis points each time, and possibly as high as 50 basis points on one of the 3 times in this year yet. So, I mean, that over a long period of time, over a 20-year bonding issue, is significant. What is the interest rate that they've projected the borrowing at? And obviously, we're not at a point to borrow yet. So, have they factored those in our debt service?
So at the time that we asked them to put this material together, they put in, and it's on, I believe it's at page 110 of 127 of your packet, they assumed a 5% interest rate. So I think inherent in your question is, do we think we'd get a better rate than 5%? And I think the short answer is yes. That said, I haven't reached back out to PFM to get an update. But as the market indice graph shows, I think there's also the potential that, we'll see if that Fed drop comes through. That would be, again, advantageous for us. If other market conditions change, they assumed, this is my characterization, please, Sam, jump in if you feel otherwise. They assumed, I think, a very conservative 5% interest rate for purposes of putting together these schedules. I did have a conversation with a municipal representative a couple of weeks ago, I want to say, and they were borrowing for a shorter term, albeit, but I know their rate was significantly better than 5%.
I had a conversation with Jerry Klein relative to some Rib Mountain borrowing, and I think they were in that 3.3 range. I don't know the term duration, so I think rates are coming down.
Yeah, that was the same municipal representative that I was referring to. So I think I want to say their term was less than 10 years. But certainly, I think, again, going back to the previous questions about and comments and with other agenda items and why a strong bond rating is important, having that AA1 rating is advantageous when you do go out to market.
Supervisor Poole.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just first, I would like to see the debt service trending downward payments. Overall, I think that would be a good thing to pursue. But are there any other major expenditures besides the highway department that would potentially drive debt up that we'd have to pay for?
That's a really good question. I think I'll defer to Chris on the utilization of, or the need to utilize borrowing for ongoing maintenance. Make a couple of statements. The county board over the last 5 years you have cleaned up, for lack of a better term, a lot of maintenance that went deferred for a great long time, other than, of course, the highway shop, the Wausau Highway Shop. In terms of other additional large projects, I think, as was alluded to by Jim, the West Side Master Plan is really one where the county board will need to identify what you want to pursue. And then really the question becomes one of, and I know that Director Polly is very attuned to this, what partnerships, as was alluded to before by, I think, yourself and Supervisor Hart, what partnerships, public-private partnerships, need to exist to finance those projects, primarily the ice arena. The county has the ice arena at Marathon Park, those ice sheets. They are in dire need of replacement. That said, they are not mandatory services to have ice sheets. if the county is going to have those ice sheets, I think it behooves us to sit down and have a conversation with the users, develop a strong strategy with respect to reimbursement. So that's really the other big project, but that is not as far along in terms of planning. I will say in the next couple months, Jamie's going to bring a ice arena study that the county board funded forward. The consultants have evaluated what it would cost to build those new ice sheets and what it would look like to finance the debt. So that's the only other project that I would see outstanding that's in that large bonding level project. Marathon County has, I don't want to say a really unique, there are a number of counties that do this. St. Croix is another. But our process of having that audited balance roll into CIP has mitigated the need to kind of start using borrowing for a lot of routine maintenance, which has served us well. But that was a long explanation. Anything, Chris, that in your mind you're thinking a big, substantial cost relative to what people might think is an otherwise routine maintenance or replacement project?
Not on the top of my head. I don't think there's anything other than what you've mentioned. There's other things to address like parks, party street location, but there's things out there that you can address with, shorter. You could phase different pieces of that to account for things without borrowing. But yeah, ultimately, whichever direction we head with any project like this that the county's looking at, there'll probably be some sort of borrowing involved depending on available funds. But I mean, the funding strategy is ultimately the board's decision. So you're probably not going to get away from borrowing, but I think back to the administrator's earlier point, it ties back into how debt service plays into the mill rate and sort of stabilizing things so that if you got to a point where you maybe deferred maintenance or took shorter term approaches to some of the issues you're facing and then had to jump up to address something bigger down the road, you might generate some of the peaks and valleys you try to avoid in general. But yeah, project-wise, the county's invested a significant amount of money on a lot of its major infrastructure. The only question marks I have, again, are more of the facilities that we haven't historically taken care of, but none of them are, blinking out there on the radar as something of this magnitude.
Thank you.
Yeah, one other thing I would add is, the consolidation effort we're doing, I think also sets us up for, we've done a lot of facility work. We've also sold a number of parcels that the county board, this committee primarily, has directed us to try to look at where do we have property that we can divest. We have to start to really find how to do that with Thomas Street and with River Drive come probably the middle of next year is really when River Drive is going to be available for redevelopment, whether that's divestment or some other form of potential ongoing revenue to offset some of our costs. But what we really want to get out of is the need to maintain those buildings. 85% of the cost of a building is after you build it. It's the lifetime of the building.
Supervisor Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Since we do have the two pieces, the highway reserve and then we have the bonding piece, is it possible to stage this project where you take the highway reserves that you do have and build pieces of it and are able to wait until that 2030 mark to finish and do the bonding and keep that mill rate level?
I think that's the conversation that needs to happen. I mean, I didn't get into the specifics with PFM about how we could structure that debt, but I think you're absolutely right. We need to have the strategy in place, and the board needs to approve that strategy and pass any authorizing resolutions. It would be my 2 cents, because you want to make sure you have the $60 million to pay the bills when you sign the contract to build the facility. The first step, I think, to your point about staging things and starting to get in a place to do this is going to be primarily what our closed session conversation's about, is We need to find some neighbors who get along with Jim first, but I think that is exactly your point. On this line, find a way to, essentially you got about $15, $20 million. How can we structure this to flatten that, to not have that hit? And I don't know, Sam, if you have any thought on that. I'm not a financial advisor, nor am I a finance director.
That's okay. It all depends on how you strategize the bonding portion of it. I have seen strategies where they take the 20-year bonding and they have a portion of it be a notes payable to kind of extend it an extra 4 years to remain somewhat consistent without those big, huge spikes. But I know what you're trying to get at is, can we afford what we can now before we get to that point?
You can structure your borrowing in multiple ways in working with the bond community. It may cost you additional basis points if you defer
One other
the
thing.
principal payments. But I think that's probably a topic for a future discussion.
And I think also Jim just leaned forward with a very good point. When we talk about this has been a long time coming, it's also not going to happen tomorrow. The design of a highway shop is an 18-month.
18 months.
So 18 months design, at least 18 months to build.
On site development.
Yeah, so it's a multi-year project. So to your point, can you stage when the borrowing hits and when?
I was referring to staging the building certain pieces of it 1 year, following up a couple of years later with the other pieces. We also had, I believe, a resolution that those River Drive buildings, that the proceeds from those would be going toward capital projects. So that could be another offset.
Completely agree. I'll let Jim talk to and probably Chris talk to. You're right. If we staging can be a really good thing in terms of how do you set a project up to minimize cost. But it also, if you do it for some reasons, like we did it at North Central through the Lakeview project, I think that we did it very well to stage it based on operational needs, as long as you don't have to remobilize construction, because and I think Chris can talk to this more than I can, or Jim, that can increase costs. So to your point about what do we need to build right away, I think that's absolutely something we'd have to look at. That's just prudent practice. I think the part Jim brought up, and that, again, best things come to those who wait, is the idea about the Mosinee shop and how can we do these things together, still with that mindset of how do we consolidate, but rather than be consolidating multiple departments, it's consolidate shops of the highway department. Because if you have a $5 million, $6 million satellite salt shed sort of facility that you can negate the need to replace, there's an opportunity cost in having to look for an alternative.
Kurt, Mayor Chair Gibbs. Okay. Chair, Kurt, you're muted.
I apologize. I lowered my hand. I didn't have a question at this point.
Okay. Any other questions at this time? And again, we're still at the introductory stage of this discussion. If not, then if you want to pull up the motion in the, would somebody like to make the motion? Supervisor Lemmer.
Sorry, the language on that slide, I think, is a little less expansive.
I'd like to make a motion to go into closed session with the roll call vote required pursuant to Section 19.85, Sub 1, Sub E, for the purpose of deliberating or negotiating the purchase and sale of properties or conducting other specified public business whenever competitive or bargaining reasons require a closed session, specifically update and discussion regarding purchase of property for possible future county facility building site and discussion of strategy regarding the potential sale of certain county property located, specifically real property, with a parcel identification number of 168-2807-034-0982 in the village of Rib Mountain.
Is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Marshall. Is there any discussion on the motion? If not, the clerk will call the roll.
Robinson, Marshall, Gibbs,
Aye.
Hart, Lemmer, Poole, Reynolds.
Aye.
Thank you.
All right, for those that are not here, you will be put in the waiting room.
Chair Gibbs, I think, in the waiting room. Jordan's on the phone, so I have to take him out, and then he can come back in and go back into the waiting room.
So Jordan will contact you when we come back in and have you call back in.
He can call back in, and I can come in.
Oh, if you want to call back in, you can be put in the waiting room. If you want to explain that.
Okay.
Calling in works different than being on the WebEx, so I will, if you want to